But that's a carpenter. That's carpenter. You know. Let me go and see this one. All right.
Okay, I'm gonna ask that everybody put themselves on mute so that we don't get feedback. I want to welcome everybody. This is the probably about the fifth Joint Protection Committee meeting that we've had, and we sort of broadened beyond Protection Committee to allow other environmental organizations like Friends of the Bay, Coalition of Safe Hempstead Harbor, Talking Harbor Task Force, and others who are all in there doing the same thing as we are. We started this as a way to get touch base with each other, find out what each other are doing, and coordinate our our efforts, and maybe pick joint projects that we could all work on. And if you saw the agenda for this evening, you would see that the moderator is Rob Kraft. I am not Rob Kraft. Rob Kraft will be joining us. He had to take his son to the emergency room, and he's on his way back now.
Oh, geez.
Anything major, but he will be here, and he expects to be on time for his presentation. So I'm Eric Swenson. I'm the Executive Director of the Hempstead Harbor Protection Committee, and I'm glad to be pitching in for moderator. At the same time, I am also letting everybody into the program, so I may be distracted for a few minutes here and there, and my computer just said it was low on battery, so I just had to plug it in, but we're good now. So what we're going to do is we are going to have a number of presentations, all geared around using nature to control nitrogen and different methods to do that. Starting off will be Dan Fucci from Nassau County, who will give us an overview of what's happening with the county's, what they call the 9-element plan, which goes over many different methods and tries to determine which is the best suited for each sub-watershed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan and let him give you his presentation.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan Pucci. I'm an environmental specialist with the Nassau County Department of Public Works, and I do hope everyone can hear me okay. Before I was having some technical difficulties with my audio, so hopefully it comes through relatively clear. So with that said, let me share my screen. Okay. All right, so Eric, you see that large version?
You're good.
Okay, great. Okay, again, my name is Dan Pucci, and we are working on the Nassau County 9-element plan, which is a nitrogen reduction plan. Excuse me. And the purpose, hello? Okay, the purpose of nitrogen reduction is to deal with harmful algal blooms. You know, we have hypoxic zones, habitat degradation, increased acidity problems in our embayments. So these are all a result of a proliferation of nitrogen. And what the 9-element plan will do is not only, you know, call out nitrogen as a problem, but will actually begin to start to quantify numbers in terms of nitrogen reduction. So that would be something new that I believe will be very, very helpful. As we all know, stormwater runoff is a primary culprit of increased nitrogen here on Long Island. Atmospheric deposition, groundwater inputs, which include cesspools and septic tanks and things of that nature, sewage treatment facilities, and fertilizers. So again, the purpose of the 9-element plan is to identify all these items and to actually quantify in terms of numbers how we can find some generous nitrogen reduction strategies for Nassau County. Okay, introduction to the 9E plans. First of all, they were developed by guidance made possible by the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and they're designed to restore water quality from non-point and point sources of pollution and impairments. The creation of the plan is done on a local level, which means it utilizes stakeholders, which is very important because when we utilize stakeholders, these are the individuals and the groups who live, work, and recreate in these watershed areas. So they have a stake, literally a stake in this issue. And also, we like to, this plan will also articulate the problems and describe solutions to achieve various water quality reduction goals. Ultimately, the plan is approved at a state level, even though the federal government sets the guidelines. Ultimately, it'll be, in the case of New York, the DEC that will approve these 9 element plans. As we look at this slide, there's a couple of issues on this slide, but the 2 most important components of the 9 element plan, or a final 9 element plan for all of us, will be the fact that we will be able to use this, whether it be Nassau County as a municipality or any municipality within Nassau County or nonprofits will be able to stand behind a 9 element plan for the purposes of funding opportunities. A completed 9 element plan in a municipality increases your funding chances, specifically with the WQIP, the Water Quality Improvement Program. So once we have this in place, a lot of these grants ask, hey, do you have a 9 element plan in place? And then we can say yes, and then utilize components of the plan to beef up any and all applications that we together or separately may submit to DEC and other organizations. So that's a very important component as to why we do this. It's also important to note that we're looking at nitrogen not as a political boundary. We're looking at it as a watershed approach, which is very important. And in the case of Nassau County's plan, I believe we're looking about 11 specific sub watersheds in the county, and some of them actually go across county boundaries. Little Neck will reach into Queens, Cold Spring Harbor watershed will reach into Suffolk. On the south side of Nassau County, we're including Jamaica Bay watershed. So again, it's important because we're not looking at this as a political boundary. We're looking at this as a holistic or watershed approach. So having the county, the towns, nonprofits, citizens, academia together is important in terms of having stakeholders involved. Okay. These are the actual 9 elements that you will find in the 9 element plan. The first element is essentially a description of the watershed, which will ID the target pollutant. In this case, we already know it's nitrogen. Element number 2, we pretty much utilize the info in element number 1 to determine pollution load reductions needed to achieve a water quality target. And essentially, we're kind of at that stage now. I'll talk about that in a little bit with our nitrogen loading model that's already been completed. Then we have an identify the BMP.
The one behind us? Are you sure?
Achieve.
Okay, what about your phone? Okay. If that's not her, you come right back, okay?
I think somebody needs to mute themselves. Is everybody muted? Okay, thank you.
I think I muted everybody.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Okay, and also one of the elements is to describe the financial or technical assistance that will be needed to implement these BMPs. The plan should identify funding sources and strategies as to how those funding sources are going to be procured over time. Reaching out to stakeholders is very important in the 9 element plan, and we had the stakeholder group involved in this formation of this 9 element plan from the beginning, including a nitrogen loading model for Nassau County, which was started to be developed back in 2017 and was ultimately finalized in 2020. And then recently, this past July, we had a stakeholder meeting introducing the beginning of the actual Nassau County 9 element program. And we will continue to address and have our stakeholders involved as we continue to move forward. We're looking to actually have a Zoom meeting, I believe, at some point in June. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Also, these 9-element plans should have a schedule estimate, which can be very generic. I mean, we can have a time frame as to when we're going to implement or propose to implement certain BMPs in a 1 to 3 year period, or a 3 to 5 year period, or a 5 to 10 year period. You know, some of the more expensive BMPs that we may want to look at may take some time and effort and to build up the finances. So those might be things we might want to, you know, give us realistic goals and put out in the out years of this plan. And then, you know, 7, 8, and 9 pretty much discuss milestones and time frames and monitoring programs, which we'll get to at a later date. Okay, so this is the geographic boundary of Nassau County, and this is pretty much the coverage area of our Nassau County 9-element plan. There's about 11 watersheds within the county, like I said before, that we are going to be looking at. A number on the North Shore to include Little Neck Bay, Manhasset Bay, Hempstead Harbor, Oyster Bay, Cold Spring Harbor, and then Long Island Sound in general. And then on the South Shore, we have Jamaica Bay, West Bay, Middle Bay, East Bay, and South Oyster Bay. So hopefully that adds up to 11. Well, I might be missing one, but in any event, so that's the coverage of what the 9-element plan will cover. And just going back a little bit, you know, Nassau County is partnering, I should have said this earlier, with the DEC and SUNY Stony Brook, SOMAS, the Center for Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, Dr. Christopher Gobler's group, to develop the sub-watershed plan, the 9-element sub-watershed plan. It was Dr. Gobler's group that developed the initial Nassau County nitrogen loading model, which was the first phase of this project. That started again back in 2017. And now we're in phase 2 of this program, which is the creation of the actual 9-element plan. And again, it's a collaboration of municipalities with stakeholders working together with DEC and SUNY Stony Brook SOMAS to prepare the plan. This here is the face cover of the nitrogen loading model that was finalized in February of 2020. This model identified the 11 watersheds I was talking about, and identified the 11 watersheds I was referring to. And now with the nitrogen loading model in place, what we did in the beginning of phase 2, as many of you who may be stakeholders are aware, our recent work was to try to create a nitrogen reduction scenario list to look at various potential best management practice scenarios that we can look at and pump those scenarios into this nitrogen loading model to come up with numbers, real quantified numbers of nitrogen reduction here in Nassau County, looking at various components. And those various components are on, here is the scenario list you're looking at now. So we, you know, working collaboratively with the stakeholders and getting stakeholder input, this is the list of scenarios that we came up with that we are now going to have Stony Brook pump into the nitrogen loading model that's been completed. And then we will start getting some real numbers in terms of, okay, we want to, point number 1, we want to expand the municipal sewer shed. So I'll keep it referencing the North Shore here because we have both North and South Shore programs. Obviously, the big one in the house is the South Shore, the Bay Park to Cedar Creek conveyance work, where we are literally going to take offline the Bay Park outfall, which dumps right in the Reynolds Channel, and send it over to Cedar Creek, which goes 2 miles offshore into an ocean outfall. But we are also going to look at certain smaller segments of Nassau County, particularly on the North Shore. Hey, what if we look at the Crescent Beach area in the Glen Cove area? And let's say we may want to connect that Crescent Beach area to the Glen Cove sewage treatment facility. What type of nitrogen reductions would we see if we took that area, which we have mapped, and pumped it into the model? We also have a number of modeling that we want to look at in the Manhasset Bay region. There's small pockets in Manhasset Bay, Baxter Estates, Huntington Road, Bayview Colony, Secor, Terrace Drive area that are currently on septics or cesspools. That, hey, what if we connected that to the sewer system over at the Fort Washington district? What would be the nitrogen loading reductions that we could potentially see? So I think that's an exciting venue to look down. Another thing we're going to look at is the individual septic systems. As you all should be aware, or I believe you should be aware, Nassau County now has its septic program up and running, where we want to look at innovative technologies to, if you have an existing old school septic or cesspool and you want to convert it to one of the approved innovative technologies, you can do so, and the county will provide funding now for you to do so up to $10,000. What we're going to be looking at, we're going to pump that type of information. What if we have 100 of these systems converted from cesspools to these innovative systems? What type of nitrogen reductions could we see as a result of that? We're looking at some sewer outflow diversion. There's two on the South Shore, obviously the Bay Park one, and there's another one down on Atlantic Beach. Another interesting one that came up as a result of the stakeholders was the reduction of landscape fertilizer, and looking at those scenarios based on certain percentages, 25, what if we reduce it by 25, 50, 75% of the fertilizer usage in the county? What type of reduction scenarios will we find? What if we totally eliminated? What would we find? Number 5, meeting applicable water quality standards or endpoints that support designated uses via water quality analysis. Stormwater nitrogen reduction, which is an interesting one that might take a little bit of work. But essentially what we're looking to look at through the model is, hey, what if we're looking at our MS4 system, what if we can divert some of that stormwater instead of it going into streams or whatever? What if we can somehow get it into the groundwater system through detention basins or other techniques? So they're going to be looking at that. That's going to be a difficult one, but certainly one that we want to look at and explore. And of course, nutrient bioextraction scenario, which I think is a rather fascinating prospect, where we can look at kelp, we can look at ulva or bivalves, oysters, and ribbed mussels. And I believe we're going to be talking about that in a later discussion, looking at nutrient bioextraction. So we can take some of this information and pump it into the model to see what kind of nitrogen reduction we may see here in Nassau County going forward. So it's a very strong list, in my opinion. I know the DEC was impressed by the list that the stakeholders worked on and came up with. And the hope is, as we look at the timeline here, that the scenarios will be run, looking at it now probably in the June timeframe. So we might actually start seeing some nitrogen reduction scenario numbers by the mid or end of June at the earliest. And then what I would like to do is, once we get those numbers, have a stakeholder Zoom meeting and go over those numbers. So that'll take us into the June or early July timeframe. So that'll be the next major step for all of us to work on in terms of being stakeholders. Then after that, we're going to continue model runs. There may be an additional idea or two later on that can be pumped into the model later, just because this list it's not necessarily a finalized list. It's something that if somebody has a great idea later on, we could say to SUNY, hey, can you run this at a later date if you can? And they've already expressed that they certainly would be able to do that. October, we hope to have a draft of the 9-element plan, and then obviously get stakeholder edits and discussion. And hopefully by December or the end of the year, we can finalize the Nassau County 9-element plan. And just real briefly, as I mentioned, Nassau County has started its septic system. I have the website link below, so you can go to that link, and there's a whole application and a whole description of the program and the technologies that are currently available, and an application process, and mapping to see whether or not you as a homeowner are eligible for this program, if you're in a sewer shed as it is or not. So go take a look at it when you get some time. It's up and running. We're happy to say it was a long time coming, but you know, when working with the Soil and Water Conservation District, we're sure we'll have a great program. I believe the first week they had about 5 new applications in the system. And they also had a webinar recently that had about 56 people who were interested, who expressed interest in the program. So, you know, we have high hopes for the program. And of course, this is hand in hand directly with the 9-element plan. And of course, we discussed the South Shore Bay Park to Cedar Creek Conveyance Project, which is currently officially underway. So this alone will go a long way in meeting quite a bit of the goals of the plan on the South Shore. So it's an exciting plan. We're doing surveying and the beginning of construction for the conveyance work. And then we have other places where we're looking to take residential areas. In this case, I have a map of Point Lookout where we're looking to take that whole area in the lower corner there and convert that and connect it to the Long Beach pump station, which then would connect to the Bay Park to Cedar Creek Conveyance and treat it that way. So, you know, we have a lot of exciting things in Nassau County that are going on in conjunction with the 9-element plan that kind of dovetail with the plan anyway, which is good. So, but, you know, we really want to look at these North Shore locations and really, you know, between the septic improvement program and looking at the sewer sheds and seeing where there may be possibilities to connect to the existing system. For instance, now there's an IMA that has been developed between Nassau County and the Great Neck Water Pollution Control District to do a feasibility study to connect residential properties in the Great Neck District that are currently septic or cesspool and connect those to the Great Neck system. The county is providing $150,000 to the Great Neck Water Pollution Control District to conduct that feasibility study. And again, that's in direct correlation with the 9-element plan as well. Going back to the components of the 9-element plan, I have 3 web links here that I believe Eric is going to share in the chat. So you guys can take these web links and open up, and you can see the EPA guidance is the top one. The middle one is the DEC guidance of the 9-element plan strategy. And then I also, if anyone wanted to peruse the existing Nassau County nitrogen loading model, which I did share with the stakeholders, but if any of you happen not to be stakeholders, you can use this link to find the nitrogen loading models and plenty of very good information in there that you could certainly look at, which would further describe the loading model and the potential here with 9-element. So with that said, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask and we'll go from there. Thank you. Eric, you're on mute. Eric, you're on mute. Okay, let me stop share.
Yeah, okay. If anybody wants, I'm trying to post those links at the same time as.
Okay, Eric, you know what? If anybody's interested in those links, email me at dfucci@nassaucountiny.gov. That's you.
Dan, could you put your email in the chat?
Sure.
They're all posted right now.
Okay. I'm gonna send my email in the chat.
Okay. I would suggest, since everybody is muted, unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. If it gets too crazy, I guess we'll have to ask you to put the questions in the chat.
Okay, I just sent out my email. So again, if anyone's interested in those links or getting a copy of this presentation electronically, feel free to email me. Or if you have any questions later on that you didn't think of now, feel free to send me an email. Thank you.
Does anybody have questions for Dan?
Hey, Dan, this is David Berg.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, so question, I thought the delay in coming up with the plan was that the USGS was redefining Nassau County subwatersheds, and instead of 11, there were going to be some 30 or more subwatersheds. Did that never happen?
That, I don't think there's going to be that many. I think that's still up for discussion.
Okay,
Yeah. Now, the 11 that I'm referring to are presently in the nitrogen loading model. Now,
Yeah.
if any, which was obviously a previous document, so if anything is added by USGS at a later date, well, I'm sure we can all, work together to make that happen. But I personally have not heard any fine tuning or exact numbers relative to that yet. But again, it could be. But as for the purpose of the existing model, we looked at 11.
thank you, Dan.
Okay, Dave.
Any other questions? If not, we'll move to the next speaker, who's Rob Kraft.
Eric?
Did somebody have a question for Eric?
I was gonna, Tom Powell, I was gonna ask about the testing. There's gonna be a lot of testing here, and who's gonna do that? Is there any thought or predictions about how might do the testing?
You're referring to water quality testing? Well, that's going to come later on in the elements, but we're as a stakeholder group, we have to look at that. And obviously, there are plenty of groups and organizations that are doing the testing now. If there's anything that's added on a later date, we can certainly, discuss that. But again, I've expressed my opinion to DEC that we have to be realistic in our objectives as well, because you're right, Tom. That's a big issue to deal with. So, I think it's beneficial to use the existing testing that's out there now and utilize that to the best of our abilities. And we can look at a later time and later on in the elements testing. A matter of fact, Suffolk County, which has developed a plan already and has the plan on the DEC website, is just getting to that issue now. The testing issue. So that's a later issue that's tackled later on in the plan. Theoretically, you can have the plan done and then add on to the plan later on and amend it through testing as one example.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're up, Rob.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. Eric, I was supposed to help moderate this, but I appreciate Eric jumping in for me, sir. I know, Eric, you got your hands full, but thank you so much for helping me out. All right, so welcome, folks. I'm going to talk to you about oyster gardening as one of the bionutrient extraction techniques that Dan had mentioned. Let me just say it. So my name is Rob Kraft. I'm the coordinator for the Oyster Bay Cold Spring Harbor Protection Committee. I also work at the waterfront director at SUNY Maritime College in the Bronx. Related to this, we do a lot of work with the Billion Oyster Project, and that was sort of the inspiration for doing this project. The Oyster Bay Cold Spring Harbor Protection Committee, obviously, as the name implies, encompasses the watersheds of Oyster Bay and Cold Spring Harbor. So I represent the 11 municipalities that have waterfront in the watershed around Oyster Bay and Cold Spring Harbor. We had started our program because we were concerned about the declining water quality in Cold Spring Harbor. Looking from on your screen from the lower end, south to north, the upper end, the red area is closed areas to shellfishing, and that area has been increasingly expanding over the last few decades. And what was most concerning is there didn't seem to be a lot of public outcry about this or public awareness of this. So our goal is, how do we increase education and awareness? It wasn't as much about bionutrient extraction when we began, but we really wanted to get people with their feet wet and their hands muddy down to the water. And so we said, well, let's try oysters. And this is certainly by no means our idea. All across Long Island, all across the East Coast, probably the country and the world, people are using oysters for a variety of educational and ecological reasons, and of course, economic. The granddaddy of the organizations in our area probably are the SPAT program, which started probably 20 years ago with Cornell Carver Extension, and then to our west, the Billion Oyster Project, which is very, very active. So why did we choose oysters? Well, historic decline due to pollution and over harvesting. That's the negative part of the story. But the good part of why oysters is they can help improve the water quality, improve habitat, and also offer coastal protection. By all means, I'm just trying to flip through this fairly quickly. If anybody has any questions along the way, just speak up, please. So this is one of the most famous pictures of oysters that everybody steals for water, to demonstrate the water quality benefits. Many of you may have heard oysters filter 50 gallons, can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. So that they'll take out the algae and the sediments that can help improve water clarity, enhancing the photic zone, and recycling some of the nitrogen in the water. So this simple experiment, great for classrooms. You can put just 1 or 2 oysters. You don't have to put that many oysters in the tank on the right, but you put a couple oysters in, and within a couple hours, there's a marked difference in the water clarity. Habitat enhancement. You're obviously improving the amount of oysters. As you can see, the top picture here, that's from the spawner sanctuary we've set up in Cold Spring Harbor with the town of Oyster Bay. Those are some of the oysters that we've grown in our program, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But you can see mud snails and other crabs, and even the oysters that didn't survive, maybe they were eaten by an oyster drill, are still providing habitat. But they also, so it's not only habitat for oysters and other fish and crustacean, but it also enhances utilization for recreational species. And the picture on the bottom is actually borrowed from our friends in the Chesapeake Bay. And to emphasize that point, you can see just here on this chart, just within a couple of years of establishing a reef, fish production goes dramatically increases. And some of the fish are, work with the oysters. Some of them actually enjoy the oysters, like the toadfish. But when we restore oysters, it's not just for the oysters themselves, but for the whole ecosystem. And then lastly, one of the third major ecosystem benefits can be shoreline protection. There's a lot of great work going on with what we're calling living shorelines, and this oysters can certainly play a part in that. What you see in this picture here is an oyster reef here that is giving some protection to the shoreline, which allows the grasses to set up and grow without being scoured away. And then this unprotected or not protected by a man-made structure shoreline is actually doing quite well without a bulkhead or a seawall. So oysters can certainly help in that. The Billion Oyster Project is doing a big project on the South Shore of Staten Island where they're putting very large wave attenuation barriers, and they're actually trying to install oysters on those barriers just to add an additional benefit to that. Excuse me just a second. All right. Does anybody have any questions about the ecosystem benefits or why oysters before I move on to the next section? I know there's quite a few people on this call who could probably answer the questions better than I could, but I'm happy to give them a try. Dangerous thing if you believe everything I say and don't question it. All right. So moving on just quickly to what is oyster guarding. It's really just helping juvenile shellfish reach their full potential, increasing their survivability so that they, just like your kids, you wouldn't put your kids at 2 years old outside into the wild. Hopefully by the time they're 18, they're able to fend for themselves or whatever age that is. So you can see here, this is a little encapsulation of what oyster guarding is. Oyster gardeners pay a fee, and for which they get 1,000 oysters. That's about the size of what's in that bag. These young ladies are holding the oysters, which are about 12 to 15 millimeters in size each. They're raised in these plastic mesh cages like this, which are, I'll show you a picture later. And then we clean the cages every 2 weeks. We measure the oysters as Effie's doing here. This is what the oysters look like actually probably in August. They're 1.5 to 2 inches. And then we seed them into the a spawner sanctuary. So the garden itself consists of this mesh cage we talked about. That's a 6mm mesh with these torpedo floats on the side. And our cages actually have a wire here and here, the diaper clip, which is what they're clipped on down here between 2 moorings. This is not 1,000 oysters, but that gives you an idea of the size of oysters we're dealing with. In many commercial operations, they might grow these to 25 millimeters and put them out. We're just growing one group of oysters, and the commercial guys do that because they have a capacity issue. For our program, we're growing them from June. They've come from the hatchery, which maybe they started in February, March. We get them in June, and we hold on to them till September, October, excuse me. And when we put them out there, 50 to 60 millimeters, or 2 to almost 2.5 inches in size. So very, very, very healthy, good size. These are our community gardens, which I'll explain in a second. But essentially just 2 moorings with a floating line in between, and the cages are clipped to it. So this is our exciting brand new logo. And in honor of Eric, who's now an oyster gardener with us, we had to have an acronym. So it's Community Restoring and Enhancing Our Waters, our OG crew. Apparently they tell me OG is a thing with kids these days. I don't know. But once again, it shows you that the process, this is what the oysters look like at the end of the year. And this is just to remind me to tell you that all of our oysters, unlike the SPAT program, which is an amazing program, the SPAT program, they grow the oysters and the volunteers get to eat their oysters. Our volunteers are so great. They take all 1,000 of their oysters and we put them into a spawner sanctuary, an area that's you're now allowed to commercial or recreationally harvest. And that spawner sanctuary, I think I have a picture, I'll show you where it is, was set up by the town of Oyster Bay. And so far, we've put all the oysters from the first 5 years of this program into that spawner sanctuary. Once again, this is Oyster Bay here and Cold Spring Harbor here, for those of you not from the area. This is right on the Nassau-Suffolk County line. Town of Huntington's here, town of Oyster Bay is here. And I think Theodore Roosevelt, whose house is right there, would be very excited to know that just about in his backyard, we've established a spawner sanctuary. And these 5 locations that you see here are our community gardens. We'll each have those 2 moorings with a line in between them. And we'll have anywhere from 25 to 50 gardens per site. We started off here in Laurel Hollow, Village Beach, and then we extended to West Harbor Beach in Bayville. And this year we're really excited because now we have the conservation management area in West Harbor with the town of Oyster Bay, and West Neck Beach in Lloyd Harbor, which is for the town of Huntington. And also this little beach association, Eagle Dock, has a community garden. What's nice is now that we're able to offer everybody in the town of Huntington and everybody in the town of Oyster Bay, from Bayville all the way down to Massapequa, an opportunity to come and garden. And I know there's quite a few more gardeners who are on this call, so appreciate their support of this program. And if you know others, we can certainly do that. You can certainly join us. I'll give you information on that. So, does anybody have any questions so far? Something here in the chat.
Hey, Rob, it's Sarah DeHonoring. I had some questions.
Sure, go ahead, Sam.
So are the gardeners, are their locations all in open areas for shellfishing, or are they some of them in closed areas?
Great question. Yes. So all the gardens are in open areas. One of the things we're most excited about, sort of geeking out about, is Eagle Dock. If you envision that picture I showed you with the uncertified areas on the southern part of Cold Spring Harbor, Eagle Dock is technically in one of those areas. It's closed to shellfishing. And this year is the first year after many years of asking for permission, we're able to put oysters there. Remembering our oysters are 12 millimeters when we first get them, and they grow to about 2.5 inches. They're just getting to market size by the end of the year. So we didn't feel that was a threat for people to consume them. The DEC, who's in charge of keeping us healthy and safe on this issue, thought otherwise. So they're allowing us to do Eagle Dock this year, but we're going to do a different kind of oyster, same kind of oyster, I should say, different technique, where instead of it's a single oyster, it's spat on shell, where oysters are set on an adult oyster shell, and they grow in more hideous forms that are not very attractive to the half shell market, but are very attractive to creating a more natural setup when we put them out. So Eagle Dock is in a uncertified area. I think I know where you're going with this, Sarah, because I know you're thinking Manhasset Bay. And because of the other hat I wear at Maritime, I received a lot of calls from friends of mine in the sailing industry, in principally at the yacht clubs in Westchester and Connecticut, because a couple of our gardeners are at clubs with junior sailing programs, and they presented this and said, "Wow, this is great. We want to do it." We did contact the DEC about setting up some of these programs in Westchester, which, like Manhasset Bay, is all uncertified waters, and they said they want to see how this year goes with us at Eagle Dock before they expand.
Okay.
The truth be known, the Billion Oyster Project has been doing spat on shell for over a decade. So it's not going to be a far reach, I don't think, for next year if everything goes well to expand it.
And do you have some of these gardens at marinas and private?
Sure. And so in addition to the 5 community locations we have here, the Lloyd Harbor Bath Club, the Cold Spring Harbor Beach Club, I'm trying to think of other else, technically have places like that. I'll show you a slide where who has what. But what's really amazing about the program is so many different people participate. And yes, you could do it in a marina setting if you wanted to. We also do have probably about a half a dozen homeowners who are fortunate to have waterfront property and a dock, and they can hang them right off their dock.
Rob, Mike Ertel, I'm also in Manhasset Bay Protection Committee with Sarah.
Great.
I have young kids, they're in Boy Scouts. We actually inquired 2 years ago with the Million Oyster Project for Manhasset Bay, and we're told that they couldn't do it. I think you answered it, but is it the DEC who's the authority that's giving the permission or not allowing the permission?
Sure, it's the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Region 1, which is our region, Nassau, Suffolk County, has a shellfish division, and they're in charge of the permit. The permit, what the Billion Oyster Project does, our Oyster Garden program does, and the Cornell Carver Extension does, like for SPAT, is we're like the umbrella organization that gets the permit. The permit's called a license to collect and possess scientific, and it's a very simple, easy permit. But they're sort of careful with where they do it. But I think, and then part of the reason I think Eric wanted us to talk about this tonight is I think there's a great opportunity for all of our harbors to start doing this. You know, in Oyster Bay, we're very fortunate that most of our waters are open. But one of the colleagues I work with here, he's from Cornell Carver Extension, Barry Udelson, is trying to open it up in Huntington, Centerport, and Northport, either this year or next year. And I know I talked with Tom Powell and Eric Swenson about moving over to Hempstead Harbor, and I've gotten calls from you and other people in Manhasset Bay as well.
Thank you.
And I actually met with the young woman who runs the Mamaroneck Marine Education Center in their town park about helping me facilitate those Westchester yacht clubs. Great question. There was a question in the chat about could you just set them on the bottom? Yes, you can set them on the oysters on the bottom. In the area where our spawner sanctuary was set up by the town of Oyster Bay, it was really nice. The town had previously done a bottom, determined what the bottom type was. They determined it was a harder bottom, a gravelly bottom, rather than a silty, muddy bottom, which is good for oysters. But yes, if it's suitable bottom, you can just put them right on the bottom.
Yeah, that was my question. This is Steve Kleiss talking.
Sure.
Now we have a beachfront as actually it's owned by the town of North Hempstead, but it's in front of Bayview Colony, and we have a nice our seagrass is growing very nicely. It's very densely populated by mussels, but in front of that there is a nice muddy bottom, and I was thinking we could just put spat there. We're not necessarily interested in collecting and eating. We just want to, you know, clean up the water. And it seems to me to be a perfect place, if they survive, to plant the spat there and create an oyster bed, just as you showed in one of your pictures, in front of the seagrass.
So you potentially could do that. I mean, I remember one of the things we're doing is we're raising to be a larger size so they're better able to defend themselves. And you said muddy bottom. I use a very scientific phrase, black mayonnaise. And if it's black mayonnaise, really rich organic, the oysters are not going to do well in that. So if it's more of a sandy or rockier bottom, they'll do better. And then I know you don't intend to eat them, but there are other people, and what the DEC is concerned about is creating an attractive nuisance. Whereas if there's a large population of oysters, someone not knowing, you know, could go walk by and collect them for their family and then get sick. So that's what they're concerned about. And one of the big hurdles that we face with this.
Well, yeah, but you know, if we put them in flupsies, and you know, someone could go down there and take them from the flupsies too. So you know, this is very difficult. Actually, there is a sandy front in front of the seagrass, and I think they would do well there. But you know, how can we help the quality of the bay if we're going to face all these hurdles?
I think we're working on it. And I think one of the things I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk at this meeting so we can share ideas. And I think, you know, Sarah, I know, and Eric, we've talked about this, and this is what we want to engage the DEC in a conversation on about how can we do this. And to their credit, I mean, these oyster gardening programs that I showed you, there's so many, I don't know the exact number, but there's a half dozen to a dozen of these programs in different harbors around Long Island. And we're all clamoring for their time. So they're trying to address their mandate to keep people safe and healthy, while also permitting things. So I think they're taking a very cautious approach. But I think as we continue to have success, we've been doing it in Oyster Bay for 5 years. I think that will let them relax a little bit and move, you know, to the next area. And I think spat on shell, which Cornell, through the Governor's Long Island Shellfish Restoration Program, sponsored a lot of investment in the hatchery out in Cornell Corporate Extension Southold. They're now able to do spat on shell, which is a product that I've been doing in the East River in the Bronx for at least probably a decade now. And it's something that, you know, would do equally well, you know, in Manhasset Bay, and let them be more comfortable about the potential for people poaching it, because it's not on like a traditional half shell.
Right. Thank you very much, and keep Sarah apprised. And if we can get oysters in Manhasset Bay, I think this will go a long way to solving one of our problems. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let me just put a plug in here too. And one of the things I'm excited about, and we've encouraged people to do, and Manhasset may be a little bit far, but if anybody who wants to garden with us, or anybody who wants to come down and see what we're doing, we're encouraging. There's a couple folks from the east and to the west of Oyster Bay that have either formally signed up and adopted a cage or have volunteered. But we encourage you to come visit us, play with us this summer, so that next summer or whenever we can get you into your local waters, you can learn from the experience that we've had, and you'll be like one season ahead. So I'll give you information about how to do that in a little bit. I don't want to take too much time, but just real quick, this slide's been up. You folks can read it. This time of year, we're transitioning from preparing for the season to really getting into the season. We're building those cages, as you saw, and we had our training last night, telling people how to maintain their cages, and we'll build, and over the next couple of weeks, we're going to build the remaining of our 300 cages for this year, and we will deploy the oysters in mid-June, and then from mid-June through mid-September, every 2 weeks we'll go out and we'll clean those cages, and we measure 20 oysters, take an average. People are like, well, why don't you take water quality samples and do all this other stuff? It's hard enough to get 20 oysters measured. We're just doing that, and we're fortunate to have Friends of the Bay doing water quality monitoring in the harbor. So we can use that data to see if there's any issues with the oysters growing, could be, related to that data, or hopefully there's any improvement over the long term, we might see some of that in the water quality data. So how many oysters are in a cage? As many as you can fit. We start off with 1,000, which are like pebbles in a big shoebox when you first start. But halfway through the season, in probably July or August, we have to split it up. And those cages, which are about the size of a big pillowcase, if you can imagine, they will fill up with 500 oysters each by the end of the season. And they get, I'm bad with weight, but some of us have a hard time lifting those cages at the end of July or August. So we get about 500 oysters per cage. But once again, it's all based on the size. Okay. I know one of the people who's really deserves all the credit for this program is Jeff Miratello, and he's on the call. And because he's on the call, I can't not put a plug in for the program. But Jeff was a trustee for the Village of Laurel Hollow, and came to me when I first started this job at Oyster Bay and said, why don't we do the SPAT program? And so finally he won me over and we started this program. But and Village of Laurel Hollow has been an amazing partner. They're the ones who handle the online registration for us. And they've welcomed so many people to their community. They have a little beach, and it's still the most popular place where people go to Oyster Garden. But I also just want to show you this, not just the free promotional piece, but we charge $175 per garden, which covers all the costs. The program, my time as coordinator of the protection committee is covered by the protection committee, and the protection committee for the first few years gave $3,500 to this program as an education and outreach tool. But every year we've done this, we've had more than enough revenue to cover the expenses for the program. So what's really nice about this is we're all love writing grants and getting grants, but this is a program that you could start without having to worry about. It's great to have startup capital or that initial grant money, but if you've got a supportive community, you can certainly do this. And now, because we have a supportive community, we're also able to have people either sponsor a garden for other people to maintain, and we have a great core of volunteers. And that expense covers the training, the equipment, 1,000 oysters, support as much as we can help you with that, from helping you clean the cages to answering emails and phone calls. And then at the end, we do have a potluck celebration where people take oysters and clams home to enjoy, which, true to the mission of the program, it's not our oysters and clams. We actually buy them from the local baymen. One, to raise awareness, says, yes, there are oysters in Oyster Bay and clams in Oyster Bay, but also to support the local guys. Real quick, who the Oyster Gardens are? It's everybody. And I've done a lot of beach cleanups. I've done a lot of things in my years. I've never seen elected officials go into the water and actually clean cages or do the dirty work. And we've had a couple elected officials do just that. But it's really a great project. I heard someone say about Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Sea Scouts. It's great. At Maritime, I use it it's an integral part of my summer camp program. We have marine environmental science lessons every day. We have an amazing church group from St. John's Church. The students love it for community service projects. Everybody wants to be a marine biologist, don't they, when they're in high school? So it's a great way to explore that. And there's research opportunities. I have girls doing, I think it's called the Gold Award for Girl Scouts, boys doing their Eagle Scout projects. It's mom and apple pie. It couldn't be more exciting for people. So everybody certainly participates. And just to show you, these are just some of our partners. Obviously, all the villages, the town, Cornell Cooperative Extension is really the backbone of this. They're the ones who give me the oysters, provide the training as well. And then I believe this is my second to last slide. It's really a success. This is Laurel Hollow, looking over Cold Spring Harbor onto Lloyd Neck. And as I said, we started off just for this one picture here of getting people feet wet, hands muddy, down to the shore, caring about their waters. And we've far exceeded that goal. We wanted 20 gardeners the first year. We had 100 expressed interest. We had 30 or 40 start the first year, and we've grown every year since. This year, we're looking at 150 gardens, which is many more multiples of people, because each garden is a family or 3 or 4 people or a church group, garden club. So it's amazing how many people are involved. This gives you an example. The broader picture here is just a typical, we call it community cleaning. We offer people, they can go down anytime they want to clean their cage. But we say every other Saturday at low tide, you can come down and we'll give you a hand. And this is really what it's about. The community loves coming out. This is really the highlight. We do surveys at the end of the year. And yes, people learn about water quality. Yes, they understand about ecology a little bit better. But one of the number one reasons they do it is they love the sense of community. They met their neighbors. They really feel like they're doing something to help. So that's a tremendous success. But that's just not it. We worked with the town to establish a spawner sanctuary. So now we have a place where oysters can grow and thrive for years to come without the threat of predation. So hopefully they'll help repopulate and create a sustainable population of oysters. And then, and this is a great lead, and I always have this slide up. I've given this presentation a few times this year already, but I always have this cool guy in the sunglasses and the goatee and his hat on backwards here. And that's Dr. Freeman, who's going to be speaking right after me about kelp. But he's been great. I met him through this project. He's been working with graduate students to put spat collectors out there on many of our North Shore harbors to see if there's natural recruitment of oysters. And because of this program and because of the things, he's not only been able to do that, but he's helped us identify it. How are the oysters surviving in the spawner sanctuary, which is very well, by the way. But he also has done kelp and used very similar gear that we have here in this almost identical location to raise kelp for the last 2 years. So not only do we get the public involved, but we get we have provide opportunities for the research community to get involved. And so it's just, obviously, hopefully you can tell by my voice, I'm a little excited about this. It's really an amazing opportunity. With that being said, here's my my contact information. If anybody has any questions or information or wants to be put on the email list to see what we're doing, I would love for you to do that. I've been doing, because environmental protection for probably 30 years, and I have yet to find any project anywhere close to this that engages the public, excites the public, makes them feel like they're doing something really, really positive. And I don't have to write a grant for it. So it's pretty awesome. Thank you.
I think Rob likes this project. Since we're moving on to time, I would ask anybody that has questions for Rob, please put them in the chat, and I'm sure Rob will monitor it and get back to you. So with that, I want to turn it over to our next speaker, Dr. Aaron Freeman. Aaron.
Hi, thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you, and thanks, Rob. That was a great segue. I guess I'm going to share my screen here, and the instrument Rob was referring to was a little camera that we had put out in the oyster sanctuary, a little GoPro, to look for fish and other anything that's using the habitat, and trying to get a baseline for those spawner sanctuaries prior to the establishment, and then we'll use that as a baseline looking forward. So it's a good way to not spend a lot of time underwater, but it gets a lot of hours exposed to that. So I'm going to start my timer now, and I'm going to talk today about kelp. And so we've had a lot of excitement about this lately, and it's really, I'm looking forward to introducing it to you. And I want to start with a little bit about kelp biology, and then talk about how the aquaculture program might work. And I want to introduce this as sort of this idea of soft barriers, so that healthy ecosystems can be, if not they're not necessarily a perfect mitigation strategy, but together, coupled with other approaches, it can be one tool that can be used to help mitigate nitrogen pollution in the case of the kelp. And what got me started in this is a long time ago. I'm the guy on the right here. That's actually, this is historically from Felix Neck, or East Eaton's Point, so near Stony Brook. And there used to be a lot of kelp in these areas. And this is back in the 1930s, this photo was taken. And I've looked at some historical publications to figure out where kelp has been in the past. And these sites in red are areas in Long Island where kelp was present previously, anywhere from the 30s through the 80s, as recently as the 80s, and where we've looked in more recent times. And I always hear stories about kelp, showing up in on oyster pots and that sort of thing. But there's some false kelps that look a lot like the true kelps. And so there's only a few sites where I've really been able to establish that kelp is still present. So we're at the southern limit of this kelp's distribution, and there's potential that the climate change, ocean warming, has limited and increased the summer temperatures and limited the southern distribution of the kelp. So it's basically receded to farther north. So this is what got me started thinking about kelp, and mostly thinking about the loss of the ecosystem services that might go along with the kelp. That would be nitrogen sequestration, habitat for fish, and other aspects that the kelp historically would have contributed to these areas. And some of the interest with kelp has been in terms of the aquaculture. And here I've shown a bunch of different pictures of different types of edible algae that you may be aware of, and they run the gamut of many different taxonomic groups. The one that we're talking about is down on the bottom right. Generally, it's referred to as kombu or saccharina. And it's a type of brown algae, and I'll go into that. But this is the kelp that we're referring to. And when I talk about this kelp, I'm talking about a native species of kelp that historically would be present and is still present in some locations in Long Island. So we're not talking about any of these. Well, some of these other species are native to Long Island as well, but not necessarily harvested. And I want to point out that the one that people often talk about is this one in the center, hijiki, which is sargassum. It's a form of sargassum, and it is known to sequester compounds that are like arsenic that are not so good for consumption. And that's one of the things we need to think about as we're moving forward with raising kelp, is how making sure it's a safe product. It's particularly in these different habitats where it may accumulate different metals, etc. And so that's one of the things we're doing with the early stages of this kelp project, is doing a lot of testing of the kelp. I also want to point out that when we're talking about kelp, and different types of algae, we're talking about very diverse sorts of organisms. So if you were to look back historically, the center of the circle would represent the sort of the first life on the planet. And since it's diversified and branched out into different sections on this wheel of life. And so the algae that we can consume include the red algae like nori and sea lettuce, and the kelp, the hijikis, arames, are on this branch of the family tree. So they're very diverse. So quite different in terms of their evolutionary history, at least 100 billion years old, and that's sort of a guess. So very diverse, and in contrast, I want to contrast that with kale. You may all be familiar with kale, but if you go to a grocery store, there's one species of organism, Brassicia, which is used for everything: cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, and these are all from a single species. So there's a lot of variation that we can capitalize on, and we're only using a portion of what's available. So kelp this is a historical diagram of kelp. Normally kelp would be attached down at what's referred to as the holdfast or haptera, and people often think of these as roots, and that's not so inappropriate. However, the kelp actually, it uses its entire body, if you will. The whole plant is responsible for absorbing nutrients, not just the haptera or roots. And some other characteristics that are really relevant for the kelp are the facts that the meristem is actually located in the center region of it. So it's essentially you can think of it as a conveyor belt of kelp growing up in this direction away from the meristem, and kelp that's growing down in to produce the stipe. And that's another thing or the stem, you can think of that. So the blade up here is you might think of that as the leaf, but it's basically a conveyor belt with the older tips of it, maybe a little bit fouled sometimes with organisms, but that still leaves a large portion in the middle that can be used. Some of it's much more recent, much younger, and some of it might be a little bit older. So there you can harvest it in different locations along on the plant itself. So that's a bit about kelp. And normally when we establish this in aquaculture, it'd be established along lines, and the lines would theoretically be suspended about 1/2 meter from the surface, because that seems to be the optimal in Long Island Sound, where the water clarity is not particularly great, but in other regions they might sink it farther, a little bit deeper. One important consideration is to make sure that it is not on the bottom, because that can lead to problems. And to look at the life cycle of the kelp, it can be basically, when it goes reproductive, it can be just placed in an aquarium, the right temperature and light conditions, and the kelp can then attach to these spools of string that are on PVC pipes, and then they can be sort of twined around ropes that would be the aquaculture apparatus. And in this particular case, this kelp string rope was planted in December, and it grew slowly for January and February, but it slowly accelerated. And by April, we had kelp that was about this big. And this is this is actually larger than the kelp that we harvested actually today up in Setauket. And so I'll get into some of that shortly. There's it seems to be some variation that we're trying to explain here. So in 2019, December, we planted it at 6 sites, 3 on the South Shore and 3 on the North Shore. And we had to do a couple of attempts at planting it, because the first spool of kelp did not take. It wasn't a good set of sporophytes on that kelp. But by April of 2020, and this was amidst the pandemic and just trying to get any data, we managed to harvest the kelp and place some of it onto these drying racks down at the town of Hempstead on the South Shore and Point Lookout. And within 24 hours, it had dried, lost 80% of the water. So it dries very quickly into a product. And I've got some of it here it can become a product that is then, once it's fully dried, it can be stored. And that's the main way that is brought to market. And the kelps that we grew in the town of Hempstead Marina on the South Shore near Point Lookout were over 2 meters in length. And it was quite substantial growth. And here is a picture of the kelp that was harvested in May of 2020 down at the Laurel Hollow. And that was about 1 meter in length. And so I'm still in the process of looking at originally we've got the tissue samples that we're sending to Hofstra to look at metals and the amount of carbon and nitrogen. Everything was shut down last summer, so this summer hopefully they'll be able to complete those analyses. We'll get a good idea of any metals that might be accumulated, or the carbon and nitrogen that might have been extracted. So we did a similar round of growing the kelp this year we started in 2020 and 2021 in January of this year. And there was some growth of it at several sites. And those are the green stars here are shown where there was some growth of the kelp. The red stars, however, sites where we had very little kelp growth. And this was not necessarily due to poor seed strings. We need to collecting the data now to actually analyze and get a handle on this. There was also a lot of what's referred to here as slip gut, which would be a diatomaceous or single strand diatoms that grow on the kelp lines. And that seemed to have choked a lot of the kelp lines at these areas where the kelp did not do well. But I did just sort of in retrospect, looking back at the data from last year that we harvested in May of 2020. So this is a 1-year-old data. The kelps grew at vastly different rates. So on the North Shore here on the top in the blue arrows, those are areas in Bayville, Laurel Hollow, and Oyster Bay Marina. And they're harvested at slightly different times, but they had very slow growth rates. And this might have been due to, well, partially due to temperature, but on the South Shore, they grew at a good deal higher rates. And so just for perspective, let me just see if I can show this. Some of the largest growth here at the Eastern Marina and Point Lookout was on the order of about 10 pounds per foot of kelp. And just translating this is in units here are in kilograms per meter. So substantial growth at that site. Contrast to that, at Bayville, the growth was on the order of about less than 1 pound per foot. So a great deal of variation that it's important to try to figure out exactly why it's growing at different rates. And this is one of the other sort of MacGyvered sort of instruments that I put together, which is a temperature sensor that it can be attached to the kelp growth, kelp lines. And through that, I was able to look at the light quality, the amount of light that reached these different locations, at the lines at these different sites. And the amount of light reaching the kelp lines does not necessarily explain the differences in growth. These sensors also detected temperature. And so average temperatures were not that different at these different locations either. So these are just averages across, well, on a day-by-day basis, the sort of least square mean. So they're averaged by by days in May versus days in April. The average temperature did not necessarily explain the differences. But if we looked at the overall growth, again, the Eastern Marina had the highest growth. There are some of the that site also had the highest mean temperature during the months of January and February. So if I can circle it here, it might be what I'm sort of considering in terms of looking at the bigger picture of these sites are areas that have a higher temperatures in January and February might promote growth during that limiting time, and then sort of give those kelps a jump start for later growth. And so that particular site, or that town of Hempstead site, had the highest growth, but the only real difference in temperature was this January and February difference. And if we look at the maximum temperatures, also not that much different, but the temperatures were, they got warmer more quickly in the site with the highest growth. So again, the maximum temperatures might be important. And if we look at the minimum temperatures, the sites that have, the minimum temperatures that there's a great deal of variation in temperature on this location, but the coldest temperatures during the winter were not at the site with the highest growth. So that's something I've been thinking about with going forward, looking at the failure of the kelps at several sites on the South Shore of Long Island, and looking at areas where in this past winter in February, we may have had some snow events and freezing events that may have precluded these sites from having really much growth. And I'm just getting my head around looking at that that set of data for the going into the future. So I wasn't sure you've all talked about, know about the nitrogen issues in these areas and these bays on the North Shore and the sources of these. And you're much more familiar, many of the people in the audience, much more familiar with this, the sources and the necessity to stop this sources of this pollution. What it will point out is the nitrogen loads of these embayments are on the orders of 50, 150, 150, 300 in some of the more deeper bays, depending on the nitrogen load. But what I will point out is that kelp, during periods of light, is able to accumulate, remove this is based on sort of dense aquaculture of kelp. So full kelp grown on lines that would be a couple meters apart can remove up on the order of 170 to over 300 micromolars per hectare. So that's on the order of some of the most polluted areas in these areas. So kelp has the potential under high aquaculture densities to mitigate some of these effects. So I sort of blew through that fairly quickly, and I want to thank all the towns that have been involved and helpful in sort of setting these up and providing space, as well as the various organizations that funded these things, including the Moore Foundation that has really taken a lead on this this year in terms of organizing and getting the word out on kelp. So I would open it up if anyone has any questions.
Hi, it's Mike Ertel, Manhasset Bay Protection Committee. I do have a question. Earlier this year, there was an article about a kelp company. I don't know, they were basically doing it for carbon offsets, where they were growing the kelp, bringing it out to the middle of the ocean, just sinking it to the bottom of the ocean. Are you familiar with them? And is that something, because they were talking more about the carbon, less about the nitrogen. So obviously, I guess it takes a lot of nutrients out of the,
yeah,
it has a lot of benefits.
Yeah, I've heard of. I'm forgetting the name of that.
I think it's running tide or something tide, red tide or running tide.
Blue tide or something. Yeah. The idea there is the kelp is sort of set loose on these rafts that ultimately go out offshore and sink and sequester that carbon deeper in the ocean. So eventually the kelp does become, well, it is essentially, as it grows larger, it becomes negatively buoyant and it will sink. So it seems feasible. It would have to be on such a large scale, and that would obviously not be something that's used as a commercial benefit, except for the offsets.
Yeah, I think they're selling the carbon capture offsets. So if in Manhasset Bay, for example, or in Long Island Sound, in our Long Island areas, is it possible it could become a nuisance? Because I understand kelp is a very fast growing, or the fastest growing plants, one of them in the world. Is it possible it could like take set and actually be a nuisance in the area?
So my impression is that the summer temperatures are too high for the kelp to sort of do very well in these areas. So it's unlikely in the future, given scenarios, that it will take hold. In fact, it's actually receded in its general distribution in Long Island Sound, partially due to light water quality and light limitation potentially at most of the benthic habitats, but also there's just the natural habitat for kelp is to be attached to something, and it would be attached to rocks, and that's why it appears at Felix Neck, and it's still present in Orient Point, and it can be aquacultured on lines, but it has to be attached to something. There's not much solid substrate for it to really proliferate on its own in Long Island Sound.
Thank you.
Do you think the growth is higher on the South Shore because of the outflows at the present?
So I was wondering about that. I did a few samplings of nitrogen. I mean, a few, maybe a couple. It's prohibitively expensive and difficult. It was difficult this past year to do that, or in while I was growing the kelp during the pandemic. It's possible that the outflow pipes there in Point Lookout elevated the nitrogen in that area. I'd have to go back and I don't think anyone has actual water quality data from that. So that's a really good question. There are enormous differences in terms of the flow going by. So the Point Lookout site was exposed to tidal flows that were at least 1 or 2 knots, even in the marina, whereas we don't get, the other sites would not experience that amount of flow. So even given similar sort of background nutrient contents, if the water had similar nutrient content, the flow would bring those nutrients to the kelp and eliminate sort of the boundary layers along the kelp, allowing the kelp to absorb more of the nutrients as much as is present. Whereas in marinas, or the Oyster Bay Marina, if you can picture it, it's an enclosed area without that much flow, although there might be a lot of nutrients there as well. So I don't have a good answer to that question. What we'll look at is when Hofstra has accomplished their the nutrient analysis, the tissue content may be slightly different at these different sites. I don't know yet.
One more question. Is there a way to increase the growth rate of the kelp? I know it grows very fast, but you mentioned the meristem, which was in the middle. In most, I guess, terrestrial plants, it's at the top, right?
Yes.
And the meristem then has inhibitory chemicals that stop the bottom say of the plant in a normal shrub you have in your house from, budding out. So if you nick that, I mean, are there inhibitory chemicals in this meristem here? That way you can maybe nick it and kind of promote some different growth structures, or?
Good question. I think the meristem and the kelps is the control of the growth regulates the length of the stipe and the proliferation of the blade, which would be farther down. And that is, there's a lot of plasticity in these kelps. So if you think about the sort of overall structure of the kelps, the blade can be a small portion of the plant, and the stipe can be half of the length of the plant itself. So the meristem controls that. In terms of nipping it, that's one of the benefits is that you can harvest the blade of the kelp distal from the meristem, and the meristem will produce more blade. But that is actually probably limits the photosynthetic capacity of the plant as a whole, and that's certainly a limiting factor. I don't have a good answer to that question. I don't think that there's really that fine scale manipulation of the kelps that's been done, because these are planted in bulk and then harvested in biomass quantities, and each individual plant is not tended to as carefully as you might in a sort of orchard setting or something like that.
Okay, I'd like to ask that any other questions for Aaron, please put them in the chat, and Aaron, please monitor them so we can stay on time.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to our next speaker, who's Steve Kester from the town of Oyster Bay, who's going to talk about a number of different approaches that Oyster Bay has been taking with their shellfish program. So, Steve.
Hello, everybody. My name is Stephen Koster. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today. There we go. I work for the town of Oyster Bay, Department of Environmental Resources. And, it's a pleasure to be talking after people like Rob and Aaron, who've been doing such great work, including within our waters. It's been a pleasure working with them and learning from them. Rob already went through a lot of the benefits for and ecosystem services that shellfish will provide for the environment, including habitat restoration, increasing biodiversity, among other things like filtering the water and improving water quality. I'm going to just get right into it. In 2019, the town of Oyster Bay constructed this shellfish hatchery that was part of an idea to build on this continuous effort to annually plant clams and oysters into our waters. And this, you know, was a great idea. And what we did was we paired that with also developing the conservation management areas and spawner sanctuaries that Rob had talked about earlier. So we are in control. We have jurisdiction within 3 bays: Hempstead Harbor, South Oyster Bay, and Oyster Bay, Cold Spring Harbor. So we set up grow out facilities in these locations. Our main hatchery is located in Theodore Roosevelt Marina in Oyster Bay. So we know that oysters and clams filter water, clams being 24 gallons, oysters 50 gallons of water a day, and they also extract nutrients out of the water. Our program's initial focus is not only to filter the water, but also to revitalize the shellfish population by planting them into areas that are protected from harvest, so that we can increase the standing stock within the harbor, and the shellfish can naturally populate on their own, also further increasing filtration capacity. Since 2019, in 2019, we had 2 Flupsies. That was our full system. That's kind of when I came into operating the Flupsy and hatchery systems. In 2020, we were able to use the inside hatchery, increase our capacity by 2 million, and also raise 250,000 oysters with just 2 downwater tanks. This year, we were fortunate enough to receive a donation from 2 great people, Jeremiah and Dave, who work on the harbor. They actually work for the Creekview Aquaculture and realized that it was not feasible to run a hatchery anymore in their location. So they were able to give us these tanks. And that was just a few months ago in February. And since then, we were able to take those tanks and set them up. Those are the tanks you see here. This is at their facility. We moved them into our facility, and we actually were able to set up upwellers within the short amount of time. And we've increased our amount of upweller tanks by 10, which increases our capacity. Each upweller tank can hold about 800,000 to 1 million shellfish. Further, this is our Flupsy operation. So after we grow the shellfish within the hatchery, that's sort of when they're at a smaller size. Once they get to about 2.3 millimeters, we will move them out into these Flupsy systems, which are placed into marinas currently. We have them in Oyster Bay Harbor, South Oyster Bay, and Hempstead Harbor. Within these locations, we go at least once a week to each Flupsy to clean them. And during that time, we track and measure the growth of the shellfish. Here you can see this is us actually taking it out of the water from last year. And I just wanted to go into a little bit of the system here. So you can see here in the middle, this is a pipe that runs along the middle. And then on either side, there's 2 floats. In between there's actually a door that opens up, which you can see on the next slide right here. And within there's barrels that sit. We call them silos. And there's 6 on each side, meaning 12 per Flupsy. And we can fit about 66,600 shellfish in each one. And that allows us to hold approximately 800,000 per Flupsy. And what we do is it just looks like a floating dock. We open the door, we pull them up, and this is what it'll look like when we pull it up out of the water. Then we go through, we clean the mesh, we clean the clams and oysters, and we make sure that they're able to feed through the mesh and they aren't getting suffocated or nothing is getting blocked. One thing that's pretty neat is we went from 2 to 8 last year, and now we have 18 Flupsies that are going to be operational this year. And we grow the shellfish in these systems until they're ready to be seeded, when they're large enough to be protected from predators. Before we put them out into the water, we actually did conduct health report and disease testing. And we found that there was very little to no disease in all of our aquaculture grow out systems. Here's what I was getting into before, is our conservation management areas, which we also set up in 2019 when we initiated our hatchery. Currently there's 2 on the North Shore. Because we're increasing our production by about 10 million since 2019, this is creating the need to actually expand these areas and find different locations that we could plant into for shellfish to survive and become sustainable. What we've done in the past is we conducted studies that surveyed the bottom type and the shellfish densities within the harbor. And that's allowed us to get a good idea of good locations where there's a good chance for survival. And that way we could have the maximum benefit from these shellfish. And since 2019, all of our seeding efforts have been designated for conservation and restoration into these areas. And obviously that's beneficial because they're protected from harvest. And the longer that they're within the water is the more that they can reproduce and filter the water. And our goal is to create a sustainable population within the harbor so that there can be natural filtration and natural reproduction that actually sustains it. And that's sort of the follow-up idea with our spawner sanctuaries that Rob mentioned. We currently have one on the North Shore, which he uses for the oysters and the community gardening program. And we actually have 5 on the South Shore that we're using for adult clams. And we've been looking for new areas. So some of the things we look for are the bottom sediment characteristics, the water quality, the water currents, because we want to know where the larva will go after a spawning event. And yeah, and we'll look at larval retention and survival and mortality. So by continually adding to the natural stock, just like with conservation management areas, it increases the filtration and population density. Some other programs that we've been involved in are the SOAR program. This was in collaboration with Pew Charitable Trust and Nature Conservancy and Friends of the Bay. And this was a great program. It was initiated because during the COVID-19 pandemic, commercial shellfish farmers were having trouble. There was less demand because restaurants were shut down. There's less demand for oysters and clams. So what they did was they decided to take these oysters and transfer them, instead of selling them for consumption, to sell them for restoration purposes. So we were actually able to receive 50,000 adult fertile oysters that were ready to spawn. We did this in December of 2020. So by the spring, they should have spawned already. And just from those alone, we're filtering about 2.5 million gallons of water per day. So that's pretty impressive. And that's really a low amount of oysters compared to what we try to achieve with our hatchery operations. I mean, we're looking to go into about 12 million clams this year, and moving forward. Another project that we've been involved in is the Long Island Shellfish Restoration Project. This is to plant adult clams into the South Oyster Bay. It's in collaboration with Cornell Cooperative Extension, SUNY Stony Brook, and the DEC. And they've done this in previous bays as well. And what they found is that by planting adult clams into the bay rather than seed, you actually get near 100% survival. So we're really looking forward to getting about 1.5 million adult clams into these spawner sanctuaries, planted to achieve the optimal planting density and population density within the waters to allow for optimal reproduction. And we're scheduled to begin that this summer. So that's something we're looking forward to and really excited about. So furthermore, this is on the South Shore. The SOAR program is in Oyster Bay. And then at Tappan Marina, we conducted bioextraction monitoring. That was in collaboration with Coalition to Save Hempstead Harbor. Carol is on this call. In 2020, we had 4 flupsies. And this year we were putting in 6 flupsies into that location. And she's been monitoring the bioextraction of nitrogen within these flupsies as I track the growth. And I'm sure she'll get into some of the interesting things that we found throughout this time. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. And thank you for listening.
Any questions for Steve? You can always put them in the chat. So that was a good segue into our next presentation, which is by the Coalition to Save Hempstead Harbor, Carol DePaolo and Michelle McAllister. So take it away.
Hi, everyone.
We can't see your screen.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. As Eric said, first of all, good evening, everybody, and thank you for staying around as long to listen to the rest of the presentations. But I'm Carol DePaolo. I'm the Programs Director for the Coalition to Save Hempstead Harbor and Water Monitoring Coordinator, and Michelle McAllister is a water monitor, and together we operate 3 monitoring programs in Hempstead Harbor. One, the core monitoring program, which is nearly 30 years old and was initiated by the coalition, is now being conducted in partnership with the Hempstead Harbor Protection Committee. We also, the coalition has been managing the Unified Water Study for Long Island Sound since the initiation and pilot study in 2016. And the Tappan Marina was a natural project for us when we heard about the possibility of having Hempstead Harbor included in Town of Oyster Bay's plans for shellfish aquaculture in different bays within the Town of Oyster Bay. So we can go through. It was interesting, to say the least, to see the setup, as Steve had shown, of how the flupsies were constructed in Hempstead Harbor, and for Hempstead Harbor and other areas, and then for this incredible crew to maintain both flupsies and clam stock throughout the season. It took a lot of work, and they did a great job throughout. So what we intended to do was to watch what they were doing, but also try to monitor water quality for Hempstead, for the Tappan Marina in Hempstead Harbor, which is on the eastern shore of the harbor. And this was something that had never been done before. So we really had no idea what the background levels of water quality for the marina were, even though we had done open water monitoring for so long, as I said, nearly 30 years in the harbor, but weren't really sure about conditions in Tappan. So the project goals, which, by the way, this whole project has been funded by Nassau County Soil and Water Conservation District for years 2019, the first, and right through, we just received another grant to do this project in 2020. But our goals throughout have been to establish a water quality profile for Tappan Marina using the same testing parameters we've used for our core program. And some of those include monitoring on a weekly basis all of the parameters you see listed below, including collection of water samples for fecal coliform and enterococci analysis, and then biweekly collection of samples for nitrogen analysis. And though the focus of this entire evening has been on bioextraction of nitrogen, we had to really go much more broadly to, as I said, first establish what were the conditions in the marina. We had to first, of course, decide on where the stations would be located, and the marina, if you go back just one, there is Tappan Marina on the left side that's facing north, and it's against the fishing pier in the marina, more of a closed area, whereas 21 was another station. For last year, we had another station beginning in 2019, but the station that always remains is number 19, which is at the end of the service dock and the area closest to the opening to Hempstead Harbor. And then we'll go back to the 3-year description. And in 2019, although we were set up to do the program and see the flupsies installed and the clams, That ended up not happening because of a shortage of stock from Cornell Cooperative Extension. However, we began the monitoring as scheduled and did that from May through October. It gave us an opportunity to really collect solid baseline data for Tappan Marina. So we knew what we had before, and then our goal was also to find out whether the conditions within the marina mirrored what was happening in open waters in Hempstead Harbor, and then also to find out whether we could actually discern any kind of differences or impact from the seed clams within the marina in several of the parameters that we were testing for. So 2019 was establishing baseline data. 2020, we of course started with the same type of weekly sampling for most of the parameters, biweekly for nitrogen. But of course, like everyone else, we were faced with the challenges of COVID-19. And again, reduced clam stock from what we were hoping to see, and then fewer number of flupsies, and yet everybody worked very hard to get both into the harbor, and again, our monitoring program went to the end of the year. We ended up, or to the end of the season, we ended up with 4 flupsies and 2 million seed clams. We ended up getting some guest oysters as well. All of the shellfish stock were removed by the end of October. We're hoping that in 2021, as Steve had mentioned, that we'll have up to 6 flupsies in Tappan Marina, and hoping that those will be in by the end of the month. So what we were able to glean from the 2019 data, and I'll turn this all over to Michelle to go over some of the observations that we had in various parameters.
So as Carol had mentioned, there were no flupsies in 2019, but it gave us a unique opportunity to get water quality data in Tappan Marina, which had never been done before. And we were surprised. We expected to find that the water quality would be very poor in the marina. We were actually surprised that that when we compared the marina with open water stations, that there were a lot of similarities in the results. So here on the left is the comparison with the Tappan Marina 19, 18, and 20 with Station 1, which is represented here by Beacon 11. It's just outside of the marina. And the results were fairly similar, with actually dissolved oxygen dipping in some areas. It was actually worse in the open water. So it was a surprise. We did another comparison with an outer harbor station, Station 16, and the results again were fairly similar. In general, this is not a good year for dissolved oxygen. This red line being the hypoxic value, it did spend a good amount of time under there. And I think that with 16, the major difference is that the dissolved oxygen ended up improving slightly before the Tappan Marina stations. So then we also looked at water clarity in 2019 using Secchi disk, and we found, not surprisingly, this is all the stations on one graph. Not surprisingly, the best water clarity was at the outer harbor station, Station 16, this purple line. The marina stations are represented by the red and blue lines. In general, I would say that it followed a similar trend to station number 1, which is represented by this green line, with some variations. Or here it was very low, and here is the water clarity was actually very high, and we found that that corresponded to change in tide, incoming and out. This is actually an incoming tide down here, and this was an outgoing tide. But in general, we're finding that there seemed to be a good mix of water going in and out of the marina, which is a surprise. We also took a look at bacteria results. These are indicator bacteria. We used the beach standard threshold for fecal coliform as 1,000 CFUs per 100 milliliters. And over here, enterococci 104 as the exceedance threshold. We actually found that there was only one event over here where the enterococci bacteria exceeded the threshold for beach closure standards. And in general, we did find that elevated bacteria levels, of course, followed major rain events, which is the case here. I think on the pre-state rained 0.71 inches. Here we get to nitrogen. This is total nitrogen for on the left is Tappan Marina by itself, stations 19 and 20. Versus on the right, we have it's the same graph, but with station number 1 and station 16, the mid and the outer harbor station. And in general, we found that total nitrogen levels were actually not very high for this season, because we use 1 milligram per liter is like a rule of thumb for, like an elevated nitrogen level. Station 1 came close here, but in general, not a very high season for nitrogen loading, which is good. That was not the same for the following year. This is 2020. These are all the stations in the color are stations 18. We're testing station 21 and 19. And here in the light gray is from the previous season, which was much lower. So there's a lot more nitrogen here. This ranges up to like 2 milligrams, over 2 milligrams per liter. So there's definitely a lot more this season in 2020. This is just a side-by-side comparison. Again, this is station 19, which was our control station, compared with station 1 for the years dissolved oxygen for 2019 and 2020, just to show that the trends were very similar. In general, 2020 was actually saw an improvement from 2019 in terms of dissolved oxygen and not going below that hypoxic value. And then this is all the stations, and we found that there was actually a lot of consistency across the stations.
So one of the things that we found as we were going through this, and really affirms the importance of water quality monitoring, is that Steve was taking paying careful attention to growth rates and charting them for all the flupsies and all of the bays. And we were working with the team in trying to observe what was going on with the clam stock in Tappan Marina. And Steve had been discussing how one of the flupsies, which was at S dock and up against that pier, if you remember the aerial view of the marina, all of a sudden there had seemed to be a slower growth rate for that flupsy as compared with the 2 others that were in the marina. The 2 charts at the left are both at our dock, further away from that closed-in area at the fishing pier. The chart at the bottom, the growth chart, is showing the 3rd flupsy, which was S dock at the beginning. There's a line that's encircled in red that shows you that at the beginning there was pretty big difference between what was happening with the clams in that flupsy until they were moved. That vertical line is showing you when those flupsies were moved to our dock where the other 2 flupsies were. And then all of a sudden the growth rate picked up. So we were trying to, the reason the flupsies were moved is because we went back to examine all of the water quality data we had collected for this season so far. checked all of the parameters that we were testing for to see whether there were any differences. And what we discovered was that pH was the one outstanding difference that we found. In the upper right is one of our water monitors, Mark Ring, longtime volunteer, sending down the meter for the water column parameters that we test for. And this is that S-dock up against the fishing pier. And you can see the differences in the pH. They all start about at 8.4 pH with a little bit lower at S-dock. That's the one at CSHH number 18. We're looking, you can just look at the darker line is the bottom pH. And then when you look at the others, you'll see that the beginning point also similar, above 8, but where the other two at our dock were much higher by the end of the season, above 7, you can see how S-dock had dropped. We continued testing at S to see what was going on, and you can see that there was a significant difference. So though we were not able to really discern any of the differences that the clams were making in terms of nitrogen reduction, we really weren't sure whether the density within the Flupsies or the number of Flupsies in the marina were enough to see that difference. So as we go along, we'll have more data to be able to determine that. But the surprise in this and really great news was that we were able to use the water quality data to help direct where the best locations were for the Flupsies, and they were moved because we had this water quality data. So we know now for the 2021 season that the Flupsies will not be in S-dock. So that was great news. And what we're looking forward to now for the next season is that, and this, by the way, is the result of the clams in Tappan Marina at the end of the season, as compared with that first bucket you saw at the beginning, their growth rate. And we're looking forward to seeing the same good results for 2021. And hopefully we'll see some impact with a greater number of Flupsies within the marina and higher density of clams. So if anybody has any questions, we're happy to take those.
Any questions for Carol? Michelle? I guess your presentation was thorough enough that everybody understood it all. We are approaching 9 o'clock. We have some time if anybody wants to bring up some other issues. If not, then I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and stay tuned next year. We'll probably have another Joint Protection Committee meeting, possibly via Zoom, possibly in person. And if you have ideas that you'd like to see covered in a future Joint Protection Committee meeting, please get in touch with one of us on the protection committees or one of the speakers here today, and we will see what we can do. So thank you all for coming and sticking around to the end, and we appreciate the speakers giving all their insights.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks to all the speakers who came today.
And this is recorded if you want to go back and watch it again.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.